Perfect. Thanks, Nate. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I believe very strongly in the goals of this center, so I'm glad that you folks have put this together. And I appreciate the chance to talk with you today. One of the things about climate change is that we're now in a new zone of how we interact with climate. Over the long term, over the last 100,000 years, climate's been hugely variable, and with the coming and going of ice ages. But for the last 10,000 years, it's not only been warmer, which we all recognize, but it's also been in a time of incredible climatic stability. And it's only during this period of climatic stability that we had the beginning of agriculture, simultaneously in many places, the birth of all of the great civilizations of the world. So it's really during this period of climatic stability that we have come to become what we are as human societies. In the last 1,300 years, if you look at the top part of this diagram, you can see that there has, of course, been lots of variability, and even small wiggles in the timing of temperature, such as the medieval warm period or the Little Ice Age, were associated with incredible societal difficulties, extinction of human populations in Greenland, for example. If you look at the black line at the right-hand side of that, you can see that this is the actual temperature record that we can measure directly with thermometers for the global temperature. And you can see that we're leaving this zone of Holocene stability that we've had for the last 10,000 years. This period of temperature stability that's been absolutely crucial for everything that we know about in our society. So this is a grand experiment with which we have no experience, and we're having to feel our way along as we go. We know a lot of the causes of these changes in temperature, changes in population, wealth, use of resources. This gives rise to environmental changes, such as rising atmospheric CO2, changes in temperature. It's been associated with increased frequency of large floods. And then there's other things that happen also, conversion of lands by human activities, extinction of species, exploitation of marine fisheries, and the list goes on. So we know why it's happening, and therefore we have reasonably good ideas of things that might be done to slow down or reverse these trends. Here you see in red, you see the temperature rise that's been recorded historically, and two of the possible future trajectories of temperature. The upper line is the likely trajectory of temperature if we keep doing what we have been doing, business as usual. The lower line is the likely trajectory of temperature if we take extremely aggressive actions to reduce the rate of production of greenhouse gases. So far, we're still very much on the upper line. Also, you can see listed here the various likely thresholds for important ecological changes and conservation changes. And in a sense, we have choices about what we're willing to give up in terms of the natural environment if we're not prepared to come to grips with reducing the rates of climate change. So we have some choices here. And if we decide not to make any choices at all, the chances are we'll be much closer to the upper line than the lower one. The gray lines show the projected temperatures, and you can see that for the next several decades, it's not going to matter too much what we do, because the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere already from past greenhouse gas emissions already locks us in to a certain rate of climate change. But the more severe choices that we might make about the future of biodiversity on the planet have to do with choices that we must make now if we're going to follow that lower line, that lower trajectory, or some intermediate, or perhaps even some lower trajectory than that. So the choices that we make now are important and urgent. But regardless of the choices we make, we still need to deal with the warming of climate. Now, in thinking about the consequences and the actions that we might take, I think it's really important to realize that we're part of these systems that we might be interested in conserving. People are part of ecosystems. And we're used to, on the left-hand side, you can see the types of things that we often study as ecologists, the processes there, and on the right-hand side, some of the social processes that are studied by social scientists. And the important thing is that these are tightly linked to one another, both through the impacts that people have on the environment, of which climate change is one, and then also through the benefits that we receive from ecosystems, in other words, ecosystem services. So it's important, I think it's valuable to think of conservation in this context of social-ecological systems. So when I think about conservation, I can think of three potential elements that we might consider. One is the classical domain of conservation biology, and that's reducing the rates of preventable changes. If there's threats to species, you manage those threats, you reduce those threats, and that's likely to be a more positive trajectory for the future of that species or ecosystem. And so this is a way that conservation science has used to protect valued places, species, and cultures. But I think that's not enough. We also need to shape changes that can no longer be prevented. We're already locked into many of the consequences of globalization, the movement of invasive species, the changes in climate. So we have to be proactive in thinking about shaping the future rather than thinking that we can just roll back the clock and go back to things the way they were before. And so this means moving on beyond simply protecting species, ecosystems, and cultures to stewardship, or actively shaping these changes in the future. And finally, I think a third component of a conservation strategy might be imagining and creating a positive Anthropocene. The geologists now recognize that the characteristics of the current geological processes are different from what they've been in the past because they're very strongly influenced by human activities. So we are influencing Earth system processes at a massive scale. And we usually talk about this in extremely negative terms and things that need to be done to minimize these impacts, and that's clearly important. But at the same time, I think we need to put this into a positive light if we're going to communicate effectively with many of the broad segments of society that are contributing to the changes that are occurring now. And creating a positive Anthropocene is going to require a deep discussion of societal goals. What should be conserved? Who's going to decide that? We're going to have to think of novel partnerships and strategies, things that we haven't tried before. And we're going to have to be much more proactive in moving from talking about solutions to actually implementing solutions. We don't have the luxury of planning things out that we hope somebody else will carry out in the future. So let's start with the easy part, protecting sparsely inhabited lands. This is where conservation science has really made incredible contributions. And there's many places where there's been relatively modest human impact, relatively little human access and use. But people have always been part of these ecosystems and continue to have increasingly strong impact on these systems. So we need to think about these as social ecological systems, just as we have for more intensively impacted systems. So in African In many African game parks, there have been efforts to remove people from these parks so as to see what African wildlife and these ecosystems would be like in the absence of people. But I think if we're going to think about the future of these places, we need to think about these and the ways that, the changes that are, the ways in which people can live and thrive effectively with wildlife, with natural ecosystems. When the Park Service was first set up in the United States, I think it often envisioned parks as places without people. This is partly because the first parks were founded in locations in the western United States, places like Yellowstone Park, after a period of depopulation when native populations were drastically reduced through disease and other colonizing actions of European Americans. But I think we need, this is very much of an artificial view of what these ecosystems were. And I think it's much more constructive to think about these as inhabited landscapes. And as these landscapes receive increasing pressure both from visitors and from surrounding areas, it's clear that we have to manage them as inhabited landscapes. There's some really interesting things that have been done with the newest national parks that have been set up in Alaska. When these were created in the 1970s for the new areas of these parks, the Park Service continues to allow subsistence use by indigenous people. And this includes using modern means of transportation, snow machines, motorboats, and so forth. And I think it was an experiment for the Park Service, and from my perspective, it seems like it's worked out reasonably well. And so I think there are possibilities for experimenting with ways in which we can think of even in the wildest places as being the products of human ecological interactions that continue to change as climate change becomes an increasingly important factor, but also systems that we can begin to think about as inhabited systems. I think the key strategy in protecting these sparsely inhabited places is to minimize novel human impacts rather than to think of these as places without people. So, protecting iconic landscapes is an important issue. I really like a recent paper by Martin Scheffer, Steve Carpenter, and colleagues, where they talked about the interactions of climate change and local threats as causes of frequently contributing to threshold changes in the nature of these ecosystems. And people have talked about these things for a long time, but they sort of turned the table the other way around and said, well, it's difficult for us to manage climate change, although we're certainly taking stronger efforts to do that, including this week. But at the same time, we do have the capacity to manage local threats. And perhaps we can avoid many of these threshold changes if we focus very strongly on those local threats that are likely to interact with climate change to cause threshold changes in these iconic systems. So it's often much easier to manage local threats or to manage threats locally than it is at the international or other large scales. So here's an opportunity where each of us in our own communities can take on issues that are a product of local events, local activities, and think of ways in which we can reduce the threats to many of these iconic landscapes that we care about. The Arctic is one of the places where there are certainly rapid changes going on, and these involve interactions between local threats such as oil development and climate change. But I think there's real opportunities here, especially if we can learn from many of the interactions that local indigenous people have with their landscapes. There's a strong ethic of respect for nature and recognizing that people are part of a holistic system that includes interactions between people and nature. And of course, people don't always behave as their ethics would dictate, but nonetheless, there's a strong ethical framework that I think is useful for conservation. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit about Alaskan indigenous communities. Here in the bottom, you can see a picture of Fort Yukon, which is representative of many of the communities in rural Alaska. These communities have no road access. They have no access to the electricity grid, so people there are on their own. They depend substantially on hunting and fishing for food, and without hunting and fishing and without interacting effectively with their local landscape, they'd be in tough shape. This is the most widespread area of poverty anywhere in the United States, and yet they have the highest price of commercial goods anywhere in the United States, because most commercial goods, including heating oil and gas, have to be flown in, and that's expensive. So we've had a project working with people in some of these communities, with hunters and fishermen, about getting their perspectives on what's going on with climate change, trying to learn what they see and what they see as options for the choices they have to do something about it. So in these communities, we start off by asking them, what are the species they'd like to know about? What are the species that are really important to them? And they mention species such as moose, caribou, waterfowl, berries, and salmon. Next, we ask what's been changing in terms of these particular species in the hunting systems that they're involved with. Has the abundance of these animals changed? And if so, what do they think is responsible for changes in the supply? So in the case of salmon, for example, they're very concerned about bycatch of commercial fisheries as being responsible for the drastic salmon declines in recent years. Has the timing of the availability of these animals changed? So moose, for example, now stay in the uplands later into the season because it's still warm. So they stay bedded down in places where hunters can't easily find them, since a lot of the hunting happens from rivers. And so now the hunting season is no longer synchronized with the time that moose are available to be hunted, at least legally. Are there changes in the way in which people access animals? And changes in access have to do with shallower rivers as water level declines with a warming climate. It has to do with wildfires, which cause the black spruce to tip over in ways that impede access along trails, makes it more difficult for people to see animals with the brush that resprouts after fire. So access is something that substantially affects them. So one of the things we wanted to find out is, what are the areas that they do access? So we asked them about where they go on the landscape. And this shows you the hunting trails for various hunters over the last 10 years and over their lifetimes. And they cover a lot of ground, but they don't go everywhere. So it's important to know about the places that they have historically and currently accessed, rather than just knowing about everything that's within their grid cell. But if we do look at their grid cell, we can, and use downscaled climate models, we can see the geographic pattern of climate today and project out what's likely to happen over the next 50 years. And things are likely to be warmer. Venati, which you can see in the center there, is one of the communities where we did many of these interviews. And you can see that it's likely to have a warmer temperature. And this is likely, historically, the wildfire has been important around this area. And wildfires have a substantial impact on the wildlife that people hunt. Initially, fires displace moose, but usually within about 5 years, the increase in browse that occurs through resprouting shrubs makes it a favorable habitat for wildfire for moose, and generally animals return to these areas and are more abundant than they were previously. On the other hand, caribou depend on lichens for their winter food, and it takes about 70 years for lichens to recover after fire. And so the major caribou migrations from tundra down into the boreal forest no longer come to Venati. The caribou turn west when they get to these areas of intensive burn. So they don't have access to caribou anymore. As I mentioned, wildfires create problems for access to these burned areas. And in terms of thinking about the various ways in which climate change has altered hunting opportunities in these areas, population distribution and access, it's changes in access that really are the key issue with respect to managing being able to hunt. Some of this access is physical access, such as I talked about. Some of it's regulatory access. So with the decline in Chinook salmon, for example, there's no fishing that's been allowed in the last 2 years. And in the last year, it was interesting because people from tribes all the way up and down the river changed from pointing fingers at one another and pointing fingers at regulator to realizing that this was a problem they had to solve. They're a salmon culture in the Yukon River drainage, and the salmon don't survive, their culture's not going to make it. So they voluntarily agreed not to fish for salmon. Rather than blaming the problem on someone else, they said, we've got to take this in hand, we've got to do something about this. So they voluntarily restricted their access to one of their most important foods. So one of the things that we've done in connection with learning about the impacts of climate change on these communities is to try to use that information to improve our understanding, but also use information from Western science. And in some cases, these are two sources of information that tell the same story. In other cases, especially the aspects that are closely connected to use of resources, use of animals by local people, they tell a very different story. And it's interesting also that these three factors of access, distribution, and abundance receive very different emphasis by Western science and by local people. So all of wildlife biology is built around managing population dynamics. They pay some attention to the distribution of animals on a landscape, but virtually no attention to human access to animals for hunting. And so the aspect that's the foundation for wildlife biology doesn't really inform the management decisions that might be used to be able to manage the interactions of population dynamics with access. So here's a new avenue, a new set of opportunities for thinking about conservation in ways that can be beneficial to people and still manage populations. So then, the next step in all of this is thinking about potential responses, and especially talking to local people about responses that they might consider taking on themselves. As I've mentioned, they've already taken a really drastic response with respect to their salmon. One of the things that I've been extremely impressed with over and over again is the depth of respect that people have for nature in many of these communities. And for example, people often view this respect as absolutely essential for them to be able to continue to be lucky in hunting in the future. If they show disrespect for animals by harvesting more than they need or by wasting some of what they harvest, they expect not to have good luck in hunting in the future. And they tell lots of stories about ways in which this has happened to them or their neighbor or other people in the community. So it's something that very strongly guides their ethics of interacting with their environment. I think it's, as these people have already done, I think it's time to shift from a reactive to a proactive approach for managing resources in light of the magnitude of changes that are happening in systems everywhere around us. I think many times we don't know exactly how things are going to change, because uncertainty is an inevitable component of the changes that are occurring. So anything that can be done to incorporate flexibility into future options, I think is a good opportunity. So looking for greater flexibility in the timing of hunting seasons, for example, is an easy fix to responding to changes in the timing of the rut with moose and timing of their movement across the landscape. And also preserving opportunities to make choices. So at present, each wildlife species in Alaska is managed separately according to a different set of regulations. So at times when both regulators and local people have decided not to hunt for salmon, this would seem like a logical time to liberalize hunting regulations on other species that might provide an alternative food source. But that's not the way things are done. But you can see that there's always opportunities to think about changes in regulations, changes in institutions that can respond in ways that retain flexibility, retain opportunities in a social ecological system. This is a pair of maps that my wife pointed out to me. The map on the left is a map of the ecosystems of Alaska, and the map on the right is a map of the language groups or the cultural groups in Alaska. And you can see that these are virtually identical maps, and that's because for the last 6,000 years, the ecosystems in Alaska have been relatively stable, and this is the time period over which cultural groups have become well adapted to the places where they live. So what I've been telling you is that the climate of Alaska is changing, the ecology of Alaska is changing. These changes have impacts on local people. And for me, the biggest conservation issue is not just what's happening to the species and the ecosystems of Alaska, but what are happening to the cultures of Alaska. These are still substantially intact, and I think they're vibrant cultures. They're adjusting to changes that people see, both from globalization and from changes in climate. And I think maintaining and enhancing the opportunities for people in these villages to make choices that make sense to them and their interactions with the natural landscape is a wonderful opportunity for conservation. Which brings me to the notion of stewardship, which I think of as being the active shaping of pathways of social ecological change to enhance ecosystem resilience and human well-being. So there's several elements to stewardship. One is that it entails active intervention in social ecological systems, not just standing back and letting things take their own course. It involves shaping changes. It recognizes people as components of social ecological systems, people as part of nature. And there's two goals that, in my mind, are equally important. One is ecosystem resilience, and the other is human well-being. Producing the conditions where both can thrive, so that you're looking for ways, for choices that where people can thrive with nature, rather than trying to paint a choice between people or nature. There's several ways in which one might motivate stewardship. One of the traditional approaches is through use of regulations, and these are certainly an important way to constrain unsustainable behavior. But I think these are necessary, but they're not enough. Market approaches through thinking about ecosystem services and thinking about the value that ecosystems have for society is really important as a way to show how much we benefit materially from ecosystems. But still, I think this is not enough. It's an important way to align economic incentives with the sustainability goals, which is an important way in which we need to move. But at the same time, I think a lot of people do things not because they're worried about breaking the law, not because of the economic benefits that it might bring. But I think a lot of us really care about nature and have a sense of identity with certain special places. And I think that's probably true of most people in the world. And so I wonder if there aren't ways in which we can build on this sense of place, this sense of identity, this sense of connection with particular places as a motivation for stewardship, as a motivation for environmental citizenship. But it's not going to be an easy job, because sense of place is a really complicated phenomenon. It has to do with the biophysical attributes of a place, which we're all very much aware of. It also depends on personal and psychological responses of individuals to those places, the social, ideological, and cultural perspectives of people. So, for example, a logger and a conservationist might both value forests, but value them and relate to them and have goals for managing of those forests that might be quite different. There's also political and economic contexts in which issues get framed in particular places, and we need to be aware of these. So, and then there's real and imagined things about places, stories about places, things we imagined and that we might have been told in the past. So our connections to places are very complicated. They're real, they're imagined, they're personal, they're social, they're motivated by the grandeur of places. So all of these things feed into places, into our sense of place. And so sense of place doesn't always foster stewardship. Think about African game parks. Think about gated communities in which people protect those places by keeping everybody out. So there's both good, socially good and socially ugly ways in which sense of place might play out in terms of our interaction with places. But if we can think about the socially good aspects of these, I think there's important ways in which this can be a way to motivate sustainable behavior. So I think in general we can look for ways in which, well, places motivate people in some ways that provide us the similar motivations across many stakeholder groups. And we should take advantage of that and identify what it is that people share in common that make them appreciate places. And then we need to find the areas where there is hardcore disagreement, and then look for a way to negotiate compromise with respect to those issues, because it's unlikely that we'll ever completely agree about everything that ties us to all the range of places that we care about. So I just wanted to give you one example of this from New Zealand, which is the formation of the Fiordlands Marine Guardians in western New Zealand. The history of this group is interesting. This was one of the most inaccessible areas in New Zealand, so it was one of the last areas where fisheries were exploited. But just as with every other area in the ocean, fishery stocks were sequentially depleted, first with marine mammals, then with various fishery stocks, beginning in about 1850. But then, about 1950, there was a wake-up call. There were roads that were built into this area so that for the first time, tourists could get in there and bring their boats and fish. It was also a time when things were heating up in the Middle East, and the tourism industry shifted cruises to places like New Zealand. And local people could see that the things that they valued about this place were inevitably going to continue to change at a much more rapid rate than they had in the past. And unless they came to grip with these issues, that this place that they cared about in common would no longer be the kind of place they valued. So local stakeholder groups came together with a skilled facilitator, and they agreed that they would stick together and come up with a solution through compromise, and they wouldn't walk away from the table. And part of this notion of compromise was that every time any one of these stakeholder groups achieved a goal, achieved agreement on some goal, they had to be willing to give up something they deeply cared about. So only through this kind of these difficult compromises could they come up with a solution that they would all agree with. And they did work out a solution, and it took them 10 years to do this, so it wasn't an easy process. And they presented this solution to government. This wasn't a government negotiated process. It was built on sense of place of local people. So they worked out a solution, presented it to government, and government codified it into law. And solutions similar to this one have now been applied to much of the coastal areas of New Zealand. So it had a huge impact that began with local sense of place. So I was very impressed at the power of sense of place when it's put to use in this way. So we often think of the Anthropocene as the bad things that are going to happen to it, and that may be much of the way it plays out, but I don't think it has to be that way. And if we're going to engage society in making the future as enabling both society and ecosystems to thrive in the future, I think we have to look for the positive things that can be done. So this is going to require a deep discussion of societal goals. If we care about conservation, what do we want to conserve? Conservation for whom? By whom? It's going to take an examination of issues of equity, empowerment of local people, empowerment of groups whom we may not entirely trust to share our values, because in many cases they won't share all of our values. So conservation is going to have to move into very new grounds, I think. So just thinking broadly about, just from a conservation perspective, what do we want to conserve? The evolutionary potential. If we think about conservation in terms of conserving the major tree branches of the tree of life, that leads to a very different approach than if we want to conserve red-listed species, threatened and endangered species. Or do we want to focus on conserving functional types, functional groups of species that might function in a somewhat similar way to some of these species that are threatened? Do we want to conserve specific ecosystems or ecosystem services that might be provided to a substantial degree by a broader range of ecosystem characteristics? Or do we want to conserve human-nature relationships? One of the things that really concerns me is that more than half of the world's population now lives in cities. That's likely to increase to something on the order of 70 to 80%. So who's going to be making the decisions about conservation in the future? If it's going to be made by democratically, then we need to have conservation that's meaningful to people who live in cities. So conserving human-nature relationships might be a priority we'd want to take very seriously. And it's also probably true that we're unlikely to ever get everybody on exactly the same page. And so if not, how are these decisions going to be made? How can we zone these decisions so that different kinds of decisions, different kinds of criteria might be used in different places? Or is that an appropriate way to think about the issue? So as a potential goal, I think we can all agree that thriving of people with nature would be an admirable goal, but how do you do it? I think this is going to require conservation across a spectrum of naturalness, not only putting conservation effort into lightly inhabited places, but thinking about conservation across the spectrum from those places to novel ecosystems that are the product of human impacts and subsequent recovery, to conservation in cities. All of these, I think, are very important platforms for conservation. I think we know a lot about how to engage people with nature. And I think you can imagine using practices that have already been developed in various places, how you might do this across this spectrum of naturalness, creating a whole range of opportunities through things like citizen science, developing experiences for people in nature, providing opportunities for people to socialize in nature. This probably means places not only where you can go cross-country skiing and it's quiet, but places where there can be snow machines. Campgrounds where people bring their boom boxes, as well as places where people go to have silence. Restoring and shaping nature and getting people intimately involved in those processes. I don't think it has to be one or the other, but I think we need to think about conservation across that spectrum of issues. It also requires large-scale conservation design. A lot of these parks that we think of as wilderness areas are embedded in working lands or embedded in lands where people have huge impacts and where these impacts are intensifying rather than declining. So it's useful, I think, to be thinking about parks as being embedded as part of a broader landscape, and thinking about conservation of these broad landscapes and the interaction of different kinds of ecosystems in that mosaic. I've been really impressed with the landscape conservation cooperatives, which is a new federal effort that was begun about 5 years ago. One of the most successful of these is in the South Atlantic, and people probably know more about that one than I do. But this is an effort to coordinate conservation efforts across ownership and management jurisdictions. So coordination among state and federal agencies to develop a coordinated management plan, coordination with conservation on private lands. So oftentimes this kind of these conservation efforts are stovepiped into different land ownership categories. And I think this type of broader approach is a great example of ways in which we can move towards large-scale conservation. And there's lots of challenges with managing inhabited wilderness that may take new types of approaches. Managing fire at the wildland urban interface where we've got trophy homes built in flammable landscapes, where you have fires that start in wilderness area and spread into inhabited landscapes. These involve tough choices. I think more than half of the Forest Service budget goes into fighting wildfires, and of that, a very large proportion goes into managing fires in the wildland urban interface, where there's issues of property, of protecting lives and property. Now, it could be that we need to think about a change in rights and responsibilities with respect to the way in which people live and in flammable landscapes. The same sort of issues come up with respect to water. There's a very well-defined system of water rights in the United States, but there's not enough water to meet those rights. So what do we do? I think these are examples of some of the deep societal issues that we're going to have to come to grips with in addressing conservation issues. And I think environmental citizenship is one sort of approach that we can use, one lens to think about some of these issues. There's lots of opportunities and issues associated with sustaining cultural landscapes. We think of much of Europe as being a cultural landscape, but we've got those here in the United States as well. I've told you about Alaskan subsistence systems that are definitely cultural landscapes. Ranching culture, farming culture, living with forests, all of these are cultural landscapes in a sense that we need to think about social-ecological interactions. There's lots of specific ways in which we can begin doing this. Thinking about ecosystem services as component of monitoring strategies, engaging local people in monitoring efforts, developing a science of crowdsourced environmental monitoring that is coordinated and validated or not through scientific monitoring schemes. And finally, I think we urgently need to move from talking about this stuff to doing something about it. And this is not going to be easy because uncertainty is inevitable. So we'll need to make decisions about how to shape the future in ways where we won't know how those will come out. But and this is one reason to foster resilience and flexibility in options rather than focusing on, well, in addition to focusing on certain desirable options. I think one of the real advantages of a locally focused management effort that engages local people is that it provides opportunity for experimentation across large landscapes in a way that doesn't entail social engineering, but lets local people work out some of the ground rules for managing the areas that they care about. So that we have different types of management regimes, different types of different decisions, different types of goals that play out in different places. And it probably requires that each of us personally accept the necessity of having multiple categories of priorities to shape conservation. It's going to make conservation, it opens up new opportunities, but it's going to require a much deeper set of conversations than we've had about conservation than in the past. Thank you. So do we have time for a few questions? Any comments, questions? Yes, please.
This all sounds fantastic. What do we do about the major challenge that there's just a disturbing number of Americans who are willfully and purposefully ignorant on the topics of environmental change?
I think there's lots of avenues for addressing that issue. Sometimes I wonder whether the scientific community hasn't been substantially responsible for creating this problem by focusing on environmental change in such a negative light and blaming society for creating all of the problems associated with climate change. Clearly there are problems, but I think there are more positive ways to spin that message by focusing more strongly on solutions and less on the problems. There's lots of ways in which people have thought about shifting public attitudes with respect to education, with respect to citizen engagement. I think there's lots of ways in which we can make headway. I think it's also going to take some courageous decisions made at national and international levels with which many segments of society won't agree. And so I think it's going to require a set of strategies and a set of actions at a whole range of scales. But I can't think of any single way to do it best. Yes?
Referencing your second slide with the graphs of mean temperature.
Yes.
It seems like the last 10,000 years are an incredible amount more stable. Is there some way that you can explain that? I
don't completely understand it myself. there have been periods of stability in the past. There's a lot of, there certainly are global scale positive and negative feedbacks that can either generate stability or cause divergence of stability. So, for example, once you're in an ice age, you have a large area of whiteness at high latitudes. That tends to keep things cold because a lot of solar radiation is reflected, and it tends to keep things white. Once those white areas go away, you have darker areas. That tends to warm things up more and continues to keep the planet as a whole warm. So there are these global scale feedbacks, things, but I don't know why this particular period has been so much more stable than previous times.
So if you just had the graph with a longer exposure, you'd see the same type of stability periods?
Into the past, you mean? I don't know that that's the case. It's certainly an unprecedented time in human history. So we better enjoy it while it lasts and keep it there as long as we can. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the New Zealand guardianship example? So the kinds of management strategies that were ultimately adopted, can you give us some examples of what those were? Were there restrictions on cruise ship?
There were restrictions on each of those stakeholders that came to the table. And if I just list some of those stakeholders, you can imagine what some of those restrictions would be. The Maori people came there and claimed full access to all of the land and its resources. Recreational users were an economically powerful force that had increasing access to this area. The commercial fishermen were people who were heavily invested in their livelihoods in these places. The cruise ship industry wanted greater access there, and these other groups were concerned about finding ways to manage that access and in placing restrictions on what they could do when they were present in the fjord. And those are just some of the groups, but I could go into details about each of those, but I think you can imagine what some of the issues that each of those groups had and some of the potential restrictions that might have been imposed through compromise on each of those groups.
So to what extent did science, was modeling used so that people could understand what the repercussions of the different solutions were and how they would integrate together?
Each of those groups brought their own best arguments, and so conservationists were very strongly at the table here, and they certainly brought modeling as well as their experience in that place. Yes?
So I picked up on the importance of the sense of place, helping people to value their ecosystem services and make decisions, appropriate decisions accordingly. But you also mentioned demographics that we're experiencing in the country, and you said something like 80 or 90% of the people are going to be in urban centers in the near future, and the same thing goes on for the coastal zone. Increasingly large percentage of the people who live in the coastal zone, and associated with this development moving to the cities is the whole exurbanization and suburbanization, and that displaces people. People lose their sense of place as a result of that. So where you have all these population centers, there is no sense of place. And that's the voting people. They're the ones that are going to be making a lot of these decisions. So I see a big disconnect there. I really worry about how the right decisions are ever going to be made by these people that never even had a sense of place.
That's business as usual. I think we've got to change that, and that's going to take real innovation. And I don't know the specifics of how to do it. But thinking about it locally, for example, you can think about it through zoning. If a community is growing and needs to construct a new school, put that in a place that will attract development into an area where that can be contained, and where there's green spaces around that, so that you provide places for people to experience nature, so that it doesn't become just homogeneous urban sprawl. What if the price of gas were to increase tenfold and subsidies were provided to poor people? I think you'd find concentrations of people around former railway hubs. The railways would be back there, and you'd find concentrated urban settlements around those, and you'd find other parts of cities that would be abandoned or could be repurposed. Probably, I think I've heard that something like 50% of the urban infrastructure of the next few decades is yet to be built. That's an incredible opportunity to do that wisely rather than haphazardly. And so I think a lot of this can be done through thoughtful planning and zoning. I think a lot of it needs to be issues of education and increasing public awareness about the severity of the challenges we're facing. I think there's also opportunities with depopulation of some rural areas to think about how those areas might thrive and prosper in ways that their historic populations might not have imagined. I think there's ways in which people who live in cities can develop a sense of place, both for their local place where they live, through parks and things like that, but also through electronic media to show what iconic landscapes are like, to find ways to encourage people to go from cities to wilderness areas. So I think there's lots of possible ways in which these kinds of things can be better than business as usual, but I don't think it's going to be any one of those strategies. But I think we have to accept that business as usual is no longer acceptable. We have to get on from it and do something different. Well, thanks very much.